7 True New House Horror Stories. Story 1. The Walls Remember. Sarah and Michael had been saving for 5 years to buy their first house. When they found the small cottage on Maple Street, it felt perfect. The real estate agent smiled when she showed them around. The price was surprisingly low for the neighborhood, but she explained that the elderly owner had just passed away, and the family wanted a quick sale. The couple moved in on a Friday afternoon. Everything seemed normal at first. The house had good bones, as Michael's mother would say. The kitchen was small but charming. The living room had beautiful hardwood floors. But it was the master bedroom that made Sarah fall in love. It had a large window that looked out onto an old oak tree, and the afternoon light came in perfectly. That first night, Sarah woke up at 3 a.m. She heard scratching sounds coming from inside the walls. Michael was asleep beside her, so she tried to ignore it. Mice, she thought. Old houses have mice. But the scratching was too loud, too deliberate. It sounded almost like fingernails dragging against wood, moving slowly from one side of the room to the other. She turned on the light. The scratching stopped immediately. The silence felt worse somehow, like something was listening. Sarah lay awake until dawn, staring at the wall. The scratching came back the next night, and the night after that. Michael heard it too now. He called an exterminator who found nothing. No holes, no droppings, no signs of any animals at all. The exterminator seemed uncomfortable, moving quickly through the house and refusing to spend much time in the bedroom. Sarah started researching the house's history. She found old newspaper articles at the library. In 1962, a woman named Eleanor Hartley had died in that house under unclear circumstances. The article was brief and vague. It only said that Eleanor had died of a nervous condition and that her family requested privacy during their time of grief. Sarah found more articles. Eleanor had been wealthy, living in the house for 40 years. She had no children. She lived alone except for a hired nurse who came 3 days a week. The nurse had found Eleanor dead in the master bedroom, lying on the floor. One evening, Sarah was in the bedroom alone when she heard the scratching again. But this time it was different. The sound wasn't random. It had a pattern. Scratch, 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 pause, scratch. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Pause, scratch, scratch. It sounded almost like Morse code, or like someone trying to write something on the wall from the inside. Sarah put her hand on the wall. The scratching seemed to follow her hand, moving under her palm. She jerked her hand away, her heart racing. She ran downstairs and found Michael in the kitchen. "I think something is really wrong with this house," she said. Michael wanted to call someone, but who? A priest? A psychologist? They felt foolish. But that night they decided to research more about Eleanor. In the local historical society, Sarah found a diary. It had been donated by one of Eleanor's distant relatives. The entries were dated from 1960 to 1962, and they were increasingly disturbing. Eleanor wrote about hearing voices in the walls. She wrote about seeing shadows moving behind the plaster. She wrote that the house was alive and that it was hungry. The last entry was dated 3 days before Eleanor died. It said, "It is inside me now. I can feel it in my bones. The walls are breathing. The house is breathing. It will not let me leave. It wants to keep me here forever." Sarah showed Michael the diary. They decided to leave the house immediately. But when they tried to list it for sale, something strange happened. Every real estate agent they contacted suddenly became unavailable. One agent came to look at the house but left after 5 minutes, refusing to say why. Another agent agreed to take it on, but then called back 2 days later saying she was too busy. The scratching in the walls grew louder. Now they heard it during the day, not just at night, and Sarah started hearing whispers too, faint and indecipherable, coming from inside the walls. Michael heard them one morning while getting ready for work. He came downstairs pale and shaken. "It sounds like a woman," he said. "I think she's calling for help." They decided to break through the wall in the master bedroom. Michael took a hammer and started hitting the plaster near where the scratching had been loudest. He broke through after several minutes. Inside, there was a hollow space between the walls, a gap about 2 feet wide that ran the entire length of the room. On the floor of the space were bones, small bones arranged carefully in the shape of a human skeleton, and scratched into the wooden framework of the walls were hundreds of words scratched over and over. "Help me, help me, help me, help me." Sarah and Michael called the police. The investigation revealed that Eleanor's body had never been properly examined. The family had insisted on a quick funeral and cremation, but these bones suggested that Eleanor might have been murdered, sealed into the walls of her own house while still alive. The case was reopened, but it was too late to prove anything. Eleanor's distant relatives denied everything. The bones were never definitively identified. But Sarah and Michael knew the truth. They had found Eleanor, the woman who had been imprisoned in her own walls, slowly dying while scratching and calling for help that never came. They sold the house for far below market value to a developer who planned to tear it down. The developer got one day into the demolition before the equipment started malfunctioning. Tools broke. The bulldozer's engine caught fire. Eventually, the developer gave up. The house still stands on Maple Street, empty and condemned. People in the neighborhood say that if you walk past at night, you can still hear the scratching. And if you listen very carefully, you can hear a woman's voice, still calling for help after all these years. Story 2. The previous owner's guest, James, had always wanted to live in a Victorian house. When he found the 3-story mansion for sale in the historic district, he thought he had won the lottery. The price was reasonable, the bones were good, and it had character. The real estate agent mentioned that the previous owner had lived there for 30 years, but he had moved to Florida to be closer to his grandchildren. James moved in during the spring. He spent weeks exploring his new home, finding hidden rooms and old details. One day, while cleaning out the attic, he found a guest book from 1987. It was leather-bound and elegant, filled with handwritten entries from dinner parties and gatherings. He opened to a random page and read the names and comments from people who had visited the house decades ago. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the book: Marcus. Sometimes he was listed as a guest. Sometimes he was mentioned in the margins of other people's entries. "Had a lovely dinner with Marcus tonight. Marcus tells the most entertaining stories. So glad Marcus could make it." James found it interesting but thought nothing of it, until he noticed something odd. The entries with Marcus's name stopped abruptly in 1993. After that, no more mentions. It was as if Marcus had simply disappeared from the social scene. That night, James was in his bedroom reading when he heard a knock on the front door. It was nearly midnight, which seemed strange. He went downstairs and looked through the peephole. Nobody was there. He opened the door anyway. The porch was empty, but he could smell something odd. Cologne, maybe, or aftershave, but something else too. Something old and sweet and slightly rotten. Over the next week, James heard the knock several times, always late at night, always with nobody at the door. He started keeping a log of when it happened. He noticed the knocks always came on the nights when he was alone in the house, and they always came from the front door specifically, never the back door or the windows. Then one night, James woke to find a man standing at the foot of his bed. James screamed and jumped out of bed, his heart pounding. But when he turned on the light, there was nothing there. He searched the entire house, locking doors and windows, but found nothing. He called the police, and they came and looked around, but found no signs of forced entry. "Maybe you were dreaming," the officer suggested, but James knew he was awake. The next morning, James went back to the attic and searched for more information about Marcus. He found an old newspaper dated November 1993. The headline read, "Local man missing, police seek Marcus Willoughby." The article said that Marcus, a businessman in his mid-40s, had gone missing after attending a dinner party at a house in the historic district. His car was found parked in front of the house, but he was never seen again. James felt cold. He found more articles. Marcus's family had hired private investigators. The dinner party host, Charles Hendricks, had claimed that Marcus left around 11 p.m. and never arrived home. Marcus's disappearance had remained unsolved for decades. James realized that Charles Hendricks was the man who had owned the house for 30 years before him. The man who had just sold the house and moved to Florida. That night, James prepared himself. When the knock came at midnight, he was ready. He opened the door immediately. For just a moment he saw him. A tall man in 1990s clothing, pale and translucent, with a confused and desperate expression. Marcus's mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came out. James tried to say something, but fear froze his tongue. The figure faded like mist. James drove to Florida the next day and found Charles Hendricks's address. He showed him the newspaper article and the guest book. He asked directly, "What happened to Marcus?" Charles Hendricks's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his hands were shaking. "And I suggest you sell that house. If he's still there, he's angry. He was always angry at me in the end." James asked what happened, what went wrong, but Charles refused to say anything more. He shut the door. James considered selling the house, but something stopped him. Marcus seemed to just want someone to listen, someone to acknowledge that he had existed and that he had disappeared. James kept the guest book out on display. He started researching Marcus's life online, posting about him on old message boards and social media. The knocks at the door grew less frequent. And one night James woke to find Marcus standing at the foot of his bed again. But this time the figure seemed more solid, more peaceful. The confused desperation in his eyes had been replaced with something like gratitude. Marcus looked at James and then he simply smiled. He faded away and he never came back. James never found out for certain what happened to Marcus. But he knows that Marcus died in the house, probably at the hands of Charles Hendricks. And he knows that Marcus had been trapped there for years, trying to contact anyone who would listen, anyone who would remember him. James has kept the house. He has framed the newspaper article and hung it in his study, next to the guest book. He has become something of an amateur historian, researching other disappearances in the area. And sometimes late at night he hears the sound of a car pulling into his driveway. He looks out the window and sees a phantom vehicle that fades into nothing. James understands now that some people's stories don't end when their bodies disappear. Some people need to be remembered. And Marcus, trapped in the walls of that beautiful Victorian house for 30 years, finally got his wish when someone was willing to listen. Story 3. The Closet. Under the Stairs. Rebecca and David moved into the charming Colonial with their 2 children, Emma and Tom. The neighborhood was perfect, the schools were excellent, and the house had everything they wanted. They had spent months searching for the right place, driving through neighborhoods on weekends, attending open houses with growing frustration. When they finally found this house on Elm Street, it felt like finding a piece of home they had always been searching for. The Colonial was built in 1947 with original hardwood floors and a wraparound porch. The current owners were an elderly couple moving to be closer to their grandchildren. They seemed hesitant to leave, lingering in doorways and sharing stories about the neighborhood as if they were passing along sacred knowledge. But eventually, Rebecca and David became the new stewards of the house. There was a small closet under the stairs that Rebecca immediately claimed for storage. It was perfect for keeping winter coats, umbrellas, and the overflow of boxes from their move. She organized it carefully, arranging everything on shelves she and David installed together. Emma, their 6-year-old daughter, loved to play hide-and-seek, and would sometimes crouch inside the closet, giggling and waiting to be found. It was just an ordinary closet in an ordinary house. For the first week, everything was normal. The children attended their new school. David started his new job. Rebecca began the work of making the house feel like home, hanging pictures and arranging furniture. Life was good. Then Emma started having nightmares. At first, they were routine bad dreams, the kind that any 6-year-old might experience in a new environment. But these were different. Emma would wake up screaming about the shadow man in the closet. Her small voice would cut through the night, raw and terrified. Rebecca would rush to her room and hold her, smoothing her sweat-dampened hair away from her forehead. "It's just a dream, sweetie," Rebecca would whisper. "There's nothing in the closet, just coats and boxes." But Emma would shake her head vehemently, her entire body trembling. "He's there, Mommy. He's standing in the dark. He's looking at me. His eyes are so sad." David opened the closet and turned on all the lights, showing Emma that it was empty. He pulled out every item, one by one, demonstrating that there was nothing but space behind them. Tom, their 8-year-old son, stood next to his sister and said, "See? No shadow man. He's silly." But Emma was not convinced. Night after night, she would have the same nightmare. Sometimes she would describe the shadow man in detail. He was tall, she said. He wore old-fashioned clothes. His face was pale and thin. He never spoke, but he was always looking at Emma with an expression of desperate longing. Rebecca began to worry. She bought a nightlight and placed it in Emma's room. She left the door open and sat nearby, reading until Emma fell asleep. She bought Emma a special stuffed animal, a brave little bear, and told her that the bear would protect her. Nothing helped. Then one night, David was awakened by the soft sound of the closet door opening downstairs. He slipped quietly out of bed, not wanting to wake Rebecca, and went to investigate. What he found made his blood run cold. Emma was standing in front of the open closet, completely silent, her eyes wide and unblinking. She was sleepwalking. Her pale nightgown was almost luminescent in the darkness. She stood perfectly still, staring into the empty closet as if she was looking at something David could not see. "Emma," David said gently, not wanting to startle her. "Come on, sweetie, let's go back to bed." He placed his hand on her shoulder and she resisted him, her small body rigid. "He's calling me," she whispered, still staring into the closet. "He wants me to come inside." David carefully guided her away from the closet, but she fought him harder than he had ever felt her fight before. It was like holding back a powerful force in a tiny girl's body. Eventually, he managed to lead her back upstairs and she fell back into her bed without ever fully waking. The next morning, David told Rebecca what had happened. They were both deeply concerned now. This was no longer just a child's nightmares. This was something else. Emma was sleepwalking to the closet, being drawn to it in a way that neither parent could explain. Rebecca decided to investigate the closet more thoroughly. She removed every item, vacuumed the interior, and cleaned it with bleach and water, erasing any smell or trace of anything that might disturb a child. She repainted the interior walls a cheerful pale yellow and added contact paper with cartoon stars. She wanted Emma to see that the closet was a safe, happy place. "Look, Emma," Rebecca said, showing her daughter the newly renovated closet. "Isn't it pretty now? It's just a regular closet, just our coats and boxes." Emma looked inside and shook her head slowly. Her voice was quiet but certain. "He's not really in the closet, Mommy," she said, displaying a wisdom that seemed far too old for her 6 years. "He's behind it, he's behind the wall." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean behind the wall?" "The wall isn't real," Emma said. "There's something behind it, something hollow. He's been there for so long, Mommy. He's been trying to tell someone where he is." That evening, David knocked on the back wall of the closet while Rebecca listened. The sound was distinctly hollow, echoing slightly. They looked at each other with growing alarm. Why would there be a hollow space behind the back wall of their closet? Against Rebecca's better judgment and her instinct to simply move houses, David obtained a small drill from their garage. With Rebecca watching nervously, he carefully drilled a small hole in the back wall of the closet, starting low and working toward the middle. When he shined a flashlight through the hole, his face went pale. "There's a space back there," he said quietly, "a gap. And I think I can see something." Rebecca called a contractor the next morning explaining that they suspected their closet might have a structural issue that needed professional inspection. She didn't mention the nightmares or the mysterious space. The contractor arrived that afternoon and immediately became serious when he saw the hollow spot behind the wall. "This shouldn't be here," he said, running his hands along the wall. "This isn't part of the original construction. This wall was added later, probably in the 60s or 70s. With Rebecca's permission, he carefully opened up the wall. As the old plaster and wood came away, a hidden room was revealed. It was small, perhaps 6 feet by 8 feet, a space that should never have existed. The walls were bare concrete. The floor was sealed concrete, and the entire surface of the walls was covered in scratches. Thousands and thousands of scratches, deeply gouged into the concrete, as if someone had spent years, perhaps decades, keeping count of the days. In one corner, there was a pile of rotted fabric and debris. As they looked closer, they realized it was bones. Small bones. Tiny bones. The bones of a child. The house fell silent. Rebecca felt as though the air itself had stopped moving. David stepped backward, his face ashen. "We need to call the police," he said. The police arrived within the hour. They cordoned off the area and brought in investigators. It took several days for a complete investigation to unfold. Rebecca and David answered question after question. Emma was interviewed gently by a specially trained child psychologist who asked her about the shadow man. But Emma only said what she had already told her parents. The man was sad. He had been alone. He wanted someone to remember him. As the investigation continued, a detective discovered something in the house's records. In the 1950s, the house had been owned by a man named Henry Wallace. In 1952, a young girl named Sarah Chen had gone missing from the neighborhood. Sarah was 7 years old. Henry Wallace had been questioned in connection with her disappearance, but there was no evidence to charge him. The case had gone cold. And then, in 1995, Henry Wallace himself had disappeared. He had simply vanished from the house one day. Neighbors said they hadn't seen him leave. His car remained in the garage. Nobody knew what had happened to him. It was as if he had evaporated. The bones in the hidden room were eventually identified as belonging to a child, though the specific identity could not be determined due to age and condition, but everyone knew. The scratches on the walls, the pile of rags, the location beneath the stairs that had drawn young Emma to it, like a call from beyond the grave. It was Sarah Chen. Sarah Chen, who had been 7 years old, had been imprisoned in this sealed room, and had spent her last days scratching her desperation into concrete walls. The police searched the entire house and the property. They never found Henry Wallace. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist, as if he had been erased from the world by some force beyond human understanding. Some speculated he had fled. Others wondered if he had taken his own life in that same hidden room. Rebecca wanted to sell the house immediately. She wanted to pack up everything and never look back. But Emma resisted with surprising strength. "No, Mommy," Emma said. "Sarah doesn't want us to leave. She wants us to stay. She's happy now. The darkness is gone." And Rebecca noticed that Emma's nightmares had stopped completely. The moment the wall was opened, the shadow man had ceased to visit her dreams. More than that, Emma seemed peaceful in a way she hadn't been since they moved in. She no longer looked frightened or troubled. She seemed light, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The detective investigating the case found a plaque in honor of Sarah Chen at the local community center. Sarah's parents had passed away decades ago, but they had donated money to create this memorial. David contacted the community center and arranged for a small gathering to honor Sarah properly. On a Saturday afternoon, Rebecca and David and their children attended the service at the community center. They brought a framed photograph of Sarah Chen, carefully printed from newspaper archives. After the service, Rebecca spoke privately with the director and explained their connection to Sarah's case. The director wept. Finally, after 70 years, Sarah Chen had been found. Finally, her family would have somewhere to bring flowers and remember her. David donated Sarah's remains to a proper funeral service. She was given a real burial in a real cemetery with her name on a real headstone. For the first time in 70 years, Sarah Chen was treated with dignity and respect. Emma never had another nightmare again. But sometimes, Rebecca would catch her daughter standing in front of the closet under the stairs, even after David had rebuilt the wall and sealed it completely. Emma would stand there with a soft smile on her face, her head tilted slightly to one side, as if she was listening to someone tell her a story. Rebecca had learned not to question these moments. She understood now that some people, even in death, are not truly gone. They linger in the places where they suffered, waiting for someone who can hear them. Emma had been able to hear Sarah Chen. She had been able to feel her loneliness and her desperate need to be remembered. And because Emma had listened, Sarah Chen was no longer forgotten. Rebecca eventually closed up the wall again carefully and respectfully, but she never removed the memorial photo of Sarah Chen that Emma had drawn with colored pencils and hung next to the closet door. The drawing showed a young girl with a gentle smile, standing in sunlight, finally free. Every day Emma would touch the drawing as she passed, a small gesture of remembrance and connection. And in the quiet evenings, when the house grew still, Rebecca sometimes felt a presence, not frightening but peaceful. She believed it was Sarah, finally at rest, grateful that someone had finally heard her calling. The house on Elm Street, which had once held such darkness, was transformed by the simple act of remembrance into something sacred. Story 4. The Breathing Basement. Marcus and Lucia bought the house in the suburbs with excitement. They had been married for 10 years and had finally saved enough for a down payment. The house was older, built in the 1970s, but well maintained. The inspector found nothing seriously wrong. Everything seemed perfect. Their first issue was with the basement. It had a peculiar smell, earthy and damp, but not the typical musty smell of old basements. It was something else, something organic and warm. Lucia mentioned it to Marcus, but he didn't notice anything unusual. Then Lucia started noticing something stranger. The air in the basement seemed to move in a rhythm, in and out like breathing. She would stand at the basement door and watch as the temperature fluctuated slightly, as if the basement was inhaling and exhaling. Marcus thought she was being paranoid. He went down to the basement to prove that nothing was unusual. He came back up looking pale and unsettled. "Okay," he said. "Something is wrong with the air down there." They called HVAC specialists who could find nothing wrong with the heating system. They called contractors who found no problems with the structure. They called an environmental company to check for carbon monoxide or radon. All tests came back normal, but the breathing continued. Lucia started sleeping poorly. She could hear the basement breathing through the floorboards above it. It sounded like something alive and waiting. She and Marcus considered moving, but they had just closed on the house 2 months prior. Selling would mean taking a huge financial loss. One night, Lucia went to the basement to try to understand what she was dealing with. She stood in the center of the basement, closed her eyes, and waited. She could feel the air moving around her, in and out, and then she felt something else. Pressure, like hands on her shoulders pushing down gently but insistently. She ran upstairs screaming. Marcus called a priest. The priest came and blessed the house, splashing holy water in every room, including the basement. For 3 days the breathing stopped. Lucia dared to hope. But on the 4th night it started again, stronger than before. Marcus dug into the house's history. He found out that the house had been built on the site of an old industrial facility from the 1960s. The facility had been torn down, and the basement of that facility had been filled with concrete. The current house had been built directly on top of it. When Marcus looked at the basement more carefully, he realized the concrete floor wasn't quite right. There was a slight dome shape to it, as if something was pushing up from below. Marcus hired someone to drill into the concrete. What they found was disturbing. Beneath the concrete was a massive air pocket, and beneath that was water, and the pressure of the air above the water was causing it to expand and contract with the temperature changes of the day. The breathing was the air pressure in the sealed space below the house. But there was something else. In the water beneath the concrete, they found human remains, an entire skeleton weighted down with chains and bricks. The police investigated. They brought in experts in forensic anthropology. It was eventually determined that the remains belonged to a man who had disappeared in 1968. His name was Thomas Garrett, and he had been a union organizer at the industrial facility. He had disappeared after arguing with the facility's owner about workers' rights. It appeared that Thomas Garrett had been killed and thrown into the basement's water tank. When the facility was torn down and concrete was poured over the tank, he had been entombed there. His grave sealed beneath the house where nobody would ever find it, until Lucia heard him breathing. The remains were given a proper burial. A ceremony was held for Thomas Garrett, nearly 60 years after his death. The newspaper ran a story about the discovery. His family, who had never known what happened to him, finally had closure. Lucia and Marcus felt different about the basement after that. It no longer felt malevolent. It felt like a memorial. They left a small plaque on the basement wall, honoring Thomas Garrett and acknowledging the history that lay beneath their home. The breathing continued, but Lucia was no longer afraid. She understood now that she wasn't listening to something hungry. She was listening to someone trying to be heard after 60 years of silence. She would sometimes go to the basement and simply listen, and in the rhythm of the breathing, she heard a story of injustice and violence and a man who had been forgotten by the world. Thomas Garrett was remembered now, and perhaps that was enough to let him rest. Story 5. The photograph that aged Andrew inherited his grandfather's house in rural New England. It was a beautiful property with acres of land, old stone walls, and a farmhouse that had been in the family for generations. Andrew had spent summers there as a child, and he had fond memories of exploring the property. When he moved in permanently after his grandfather passed away, he discovered boxes of old photographs in the attic. He sorted through them carefully, reminiscing about family members long dead. Most of the photographs were standard family pictures from various decades. But one photograph made him stop and stare. It was a family portrait dated 1987. His grandfather stood in the center with Andrew's grandmother beside him. Behind them stood 5 children, Andrew's aunts and uncles. And behind the children, slightly out of focus, was a young man that Andrew didn't recognize. Andrew thought nothing of it at first. Perhaps it was a distant relative or a family friend. But as he continued to go through the boxes, he kept finding the same young man in photographs from different time periods: 1987, 1991, 1995, 2001. In every photograph, he appeared slightly younger than in the previous one. This didn't make sense. People age forward through time, not backward. Andrew called his father and asked about the young man in the photographs. His father sounded uncomfortable. "I don't know who that is," he said quickly. "Maybe it's just someone who was passing through." But Andrew could tell his father was lying. Andrew decided to study the photographs more carefully. He arranged them in chronological order and looked at the young man's appearance across the decades. In 1987, he appeared to be in his 30s. In 1991, he looked to be in his late 20s. By 1995, he could have passed for a teenager. And in 2001, the photograph was the last one, and he appeared to be no more than 12 or 13 years old. The photographs seemed to show this man aging backward. Growing younger with each passing decade, Andrew was deeply disturbed. He spent days researching, trying to find any documentation of this person. He found nothing. The name wasn't in the family records. He wasn't mentioned in any of his grandfather's will or documents. It was as if the man existed only in these photographs. One night, unable to sleep, Andrew was looking at the photographs again when he noticed something new. In each photograph, the young man seemed to be looking away from the camera, as if he was distressed or unwilling to be photographed. And as he aged backward through the decades, his expression grew increasingly distressed. In the 2001 photograph, he looked terrified. Andrew decided to visit his father in person and confront him about the photographs. His father finally broke down and told him a story. When Andrew's father was a teenager, a young man had come to the house. Nobody was sure where he came from or who he was, but he had asked to stay for a few days. Andrew's grandfather had been a kind man, so he said yes, but the young man never left. He just stayed year after year, and as he stayed, everyone noticed something strange happening. He was growing younger. At first, they thought it was a trick of the light or their imagination, but over the years it became undeniable. The man was literally aging backward. His hair grew darker. His wrinkles faded. His body became smaller. Eventually, he looked like a teenager, then a child. Nobody knew how to explain it. The family kept it secret because they were afraid of what would happen if the outside world found out. But the phenomenon continued, and the family was helpless to stop it. The last time anyone saw the young man was in 2001. He had appeared to be about 13 years old. His room was found empty the next morning. He was simply gone. The family never spoke of him again. Andrew's father believed that the man had simply ceased to exist, that he had aged backward until there was nothing left of him. Like a film running in reverse, eventually rewinding to the beginning and then to nothing. Andrew was horrified. He wanted to destroy the photographs to erase any evidence of this mysterious man, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. The photographs were all that proved that the man had existed at all, so Andrew keeps the photographs hidden in a safe. But sometimes he takes them out and studies them, and he wonders about the nature of time and existence, and what happens to people who age backward until there's nothing left but empty air. And he checks the empty rooms of the farmhouse regularly, half expecting to find a young boy sleeping in one of the beds, growing smaller with each passing day. Story 6. The mirror that showed something else. Christine and Robert bought a beautiful Victorian house with period details and original furnishings. It was their dream home, a sprawling mansion painted in soft cream with deep burgundy trim. The house had been built in 1889 and had been meticulously maintained by its previous owners, a retired professor and his wife who had lived there for 40 years. Every room felt like stepping back in time, with original crown molding, hardwood floors, and authentic period pieces that made Christine feel like she was living in another era. One of the main attractions of the house was the mirror in the master bedroom. It was enormous, nearly 6 feet tall, with an elaborate wooden frame carved with scrolling patterns and adorned with gold leaf details that caught the light beautifully. The frame depicted scenes of mythology, with cherubs and flowers woven throughout the design. It was absolutely stunning, a focal point of the room that drew the eye immediately upon entering. The real estate agent had mentioned that the mirror was original to the house, though Christine suspected it was even older. When she asked about it, the agent smiled and said, "It's one of the special features of the home. The previous owners wouldn't sell it separately, even though they received several offers from antique dealers over the years. They insisted it stay with the house." Christine loved the mirror immediately. She spent her first evening in the master bedroom simply admiring it, watching how it reflected the candlelight and made the room feel larger and more elegant. She imagined herself getting ready for special occasions, standing in front of this magnificent mirror, seeing herself as part of the house's long history. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. Christine and Robert settled into their new home, painting walls, arranging furniture, and beginning the slow process of making it their own. Christine was particularly drawn to the master bedroom and spent a lot of time there, often standing in front of the mirror, admiring how the room looked reflected in its glass. But then something changed. One morning, as Christine was getting dressed, she noticed something odd in the reflection. When she looked directly into the mirror at her own face, everything appeared normal. But if she looked at the background of the reflection, where the bedroom wall should have been visible, she saw something else. Something that wasn't actually in the room. It was a small space, dark and cramped, with walls made of rough stone. The stone looked ancient and damp. In the reflection, Christine could make out details of this impossible room. Sometimes she could see candles burning against the stone walls, their light casting dancing shadows. Sometimes she could see objects hanging on the walls, and on closer inspection, they appeared to be chains and restraints, old iron implements that suggested confinement. Christine blinked and looked around the actual bedroom. The walls were papered in a soft floral pattern. There were windows with heavy drapes. The furniture was Victorian and elegant. There was no stone room. There was no dungeon. But in the mirror, the stone chamber remained visible, as clear as day. She mentioned it to Robert that evening. "Maybe the light is hitting the mirror at a strange angle," he suggested, though he sounded uncertain. "Old mirrors sometimes create illusions. It could be a distortion in the glass." Robert looked in the mirror with her the next morning. He stared at his own reflection, then at the background. "I see the bedroom," he said. "Just our bedroom. I don't see any stone room." "Look harder," Christine urged. "Look at the very back of the reflection, beyond where the wall should be." Robert studied the mirror for a long time. "I'm sorry, Christine. I just see our bedroom. I don't see anything else," but Christine continued to see it. Every time she looked in the mirror, the stone room was there. And as the days passed, she began to see it more clearly. She could make out details of the chamber now. She could see marks on the walls, scratches and gouges as if something or someone had clawed at the stone. She could see the chains more distinctly, heavy iron chains attached to the walls, And sometimes, in the deepest shadow of the stone chamber, she thought she could see a shape, a human shape, a figure hunched against the far wall. Christine became obsessed. She would stand in front of the mirror for hours trying to understand what she was seeing. Robert expressed concern about her behavior, suggesting that perhaps stress was causing her to see things that weren't there. But Christine knew she wasn't imagining it. The mirror was showing her something real, something from somewhere else, something trapped in the glass itself. She began researching the mirror's history. She contacted antique dealers and museum curators, sending them photographs of the ornate frame. Slowly, a history began to emerge. The mirror had originally come from a castle in Europe, specifically from a castle in France that had belonged to a wealthy family centuries ago. An American collector had purchased it in the 1920s during one of the European grand tours that wealthy Americans were known to make. The collector had donated it to a major museum in New York in the 1950s as part of his estate. But the museum had sold it at an auction in the 1970s, claiming it was acquiring too many pieces and needed to streamline their collection. Since then, it had passed through several private hands, changing ownership multiple times over the decades. And Christine discovered something else. Something that chilled her to the bone. Several of the previous owners had experienced mental health crises or mysterious illnesses after acquiring the mirror. One woman had become severely depressed and was eventually hospitalized. Another owner had become obsessed with the mirror, spending nearly all of his time standing in front of it, refusing to eat or sleep. He had to be physically removed from his home and placed in a psychiatric facility. Most disturbing of all, one previous owner, a woman named Margaret Chen, had been found dead in front of the mirror with her wrists slashed. The death had been ruled a suicide, though the investigating detective's notes suggested he believed something else had driven her to it. Christine showed this information to Robert. He became very concerned. "We need to get rid of this mirror," he said firmly. "I don't care how valuable it is. Whatever history it has, it's not worth having it in our home. I won't lose you to it." Christine wanted to agree with him. She wanted to call an auction house and have it removed immediately. But she couldn't. She felt drawn to the mirror with a force she couldn't explain. She felt that if she abandoned it now, the opportunity to understand it would be lost forever. And more than that, she felt that the mirror needed her. The despair she sensed coming from within it, the longing and the anguish felt like a plea for help. She covered the mirror with a thick sheet, blocking her view of it. For 2 days she avoided the master bedroom, but even then she could sense it there, waiting for her. And in the reflections of other mirrors throughout the house, the hallway mirror, the bathroom mirror, she could still see glimpses of the stone chamber. It was as if the mirror's vision had spread to other reflective surfaces, seeping out like an infection. On the third night, Christine removed the sheet. She stood in front of the mirror for hours, not eating, not moving, simply staring into its depths. And as she stared, her mind seemed to quiet. The despair and anguish she could sense from within the mirror didn't feel malevolent. It felt desperate. It felt like someone trying to communicate across an impossible distance. And then, without knowing how she knew, Christine understood. Someone was trapped in that stone chamber. Someone had been imprisoned there long ago, possibly centuries ago. And their suffering had been so intense, so overwhelming, that it had somehow become absorbed into the very fabric of the mirror. The mirror had captured not just the reflection of the room, but the essence of their suffering, their despair, and their longing for freedom. Christine could feel the weight of this person's emotions. She could sense their heartbreak, their rage at being locked away, their desperate longing for sunlight and freedom that would never come. That night, she made a decision. She would find out who this person was and why they had been imprisoned. She would uncover the truth, and in doing so, she would help free them. Christine began corresponding with historians and curators at French museums. She submitted photographs of the mirror frame and asked for any information about its origins. After weeks of research, she received a response from a woman named Dr. Simone Leclerc, who worked at a museum in Lyon, France. Dr. Leclerc recognized the mirror from historical documents. It had come from the Château de Montfort, a castle in the Loire Valley that had belonged to a noble family for centuries. Christine made arrangements to travel to France. She spent a week there, staying in a small hotel near the castle, meeting with Dr. Leclerc and other historians. They spent hours in the castle's archives looking through old documents, letters, and records that stretched back centuries. And then they found it. In a leather-bound journal dated 1693 was the story of a woman named Margot. Margot had been the young mistress of the Marquis de Montfort, a powerful nobleman. She had become pregnant, and the Marquis's wife, a woman named Isabel, had discovered the affair. Isabel was furious and jealous. She could not divorce her husband, could not punish him directly without shame to herself, so she did something far worse. She had Margot locked away in a stone chamber deep beneath the castle, in the dungeons where prisoners were held. She made sure that Margot's pregnancy would be known to no one outside the family, and she left her there. Margot gave birth to a child in that chamber in complete darkness with no assistance. The documents were unclear, but it appeared that the child, a daughter, had been stillborn or had died shortly after birth. After the birth, Margot had been left alone in the chamber for years, decades possibly. The records showed that Margot had eventually died in that prison. She had been buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the castle grounds. Her name had been erased from the family records. It was as if Isabel had tried to erase her from history itself, but there was more. According to the documents, a mirror had been commissioned by the Marquis after Margot's death. It had been created in Florence by a renowned craftsman, and it had been made from glass that had been supposedly blessed and treated with special processes. The Marquis had wanted the mirror to serve as a memorial to his lost love, though his wife had never known the truth about why he wanted it. The mirror had been displayed in the castle for centuries, and local people had whispered that it showed visions of the dungeons, that it carried the trapped spirit of a woman who had died in darkness. Christine returned home with this knowledge, her heart heavy but her purpose clear. She called her priest, Father Michael, and explained the situation as best she could. She told him about the mirror, about the visions it showed, about the woman named Margot who had been imprisoned and forgotten. To his credit, Father Michael did not dismiss her as crazy. Instead, he agreed to perform a blessing on the mirror, a ritual designed to honor the dead and help release trapped spirits. On a Saturday evening, Father Michael came to Christine and Robert's home. He brought holy water and candles. In the master bedroom, with Christine and Robert standing nearby, Father Michael approached the mirror. He spoke prayers in Latin, words designed to honor the dead and grant peace to tortured souls. Christine watched the mirror intently. At first, nothing happened. Then slowly the image began to change. The stone chamber that had been so vivid and clear began to fade. The walls grew translucent. The candles that had been burning in the reflection went out one by one. The chains on the walls seemed to dissolve into nothing. Father Michael continued praying, his voice steady and certain. And then Christine saw something that made her tears fall. In the mirror, a face appeared. It was the face of a woman, pale and tragic, with dark eyes filled with centuries of sorrow. But as Christine watched, the expression on the woman's face changed. The despair faded. A peace seemed to settle over her features. And then for just a moment the woman smiled. It was a smile of gratitude and relief, a smile that spoke of finally being seen, finally being acknowledged, finally being freed from the darkness that had held her for so long. The image faded completely. From that moment on, the mirror reflected only their bedroom. The stone chamber was gone. The chains were gone. The desperate shape that Christine had thought she saw in the shadows was gone. The mirror had returned to being just a mirror, a beautiful antique that reflected light and images and nothing more. Christine kept the mirror but changed how she treated it. She no longer stood in front of it for hours. Instead, she cared for it with reverence and respect, dusting it carefully and ensuring it was protected from harm. She understood now that objects could carry memories, that they could hold on to trauma and suffering, that they could serve as vessels for the despair of people who had been forgotten by history. She had visited the Chateau website and discovered that modern archaeologists had indeed found unmarked graves on the castle grounds. Some of the remains had been dated to the 17th century. Christine made a donation to a scholarship fund dedicated to studying the lives of forgotten people in European history. Women whose stories had been lost or erased by time. Every time Christine looked at the mirror now, she thought of Margot. She thought of a young woman who had suffered in darkness, who had been denied her story, who had been written out of history by a jealous and powerful wife. And she was grateful that somehow through the mirror, Margot's suffering had been witnessed. Somehow she had been remembered. Robert noticed that Christine seemed more at peace now. The obsessive quality that had characterized her behavior around the mirror had faded. She still loved the mirror, but in a different way. She loved it as a memorial, as a way of honoring a lost woman and a terrible history. And sometimes, when light hit the mirror at certain angles and created unusual reflections, Christine thought she could see that peaceful face again, smiling in gratitude. She would smile back, a silent acknowledgement between two women separated by centuries, a connection formed by suffering acknowledged and finally released. The mirror remained in their home, a beautiful and haunting piece of art that told a story most people would never know. But Christine knew, and that was enough. Story 7. The House That Remembered Everything. Lisa was a renovator, a skilled and ambitious woman who had built her reputation on buying old houses that other people had given up on. She would see a decrepit structure with broken windows and overgrown yards, and where everyone else saw a money pit, she saw potential. Over 15 years, she had successfully flipped dozens of properties across New Jersey and Pennsylvania, turning them from neglected relics into desirable homes. She had won awards for her restoration work. Local real estate agents called her when they had difficult properties. Banks trusted her with their worst investments. Lisa took pride in her work. She believed that old houses deserved a second chance, that they had stories to tell if you were willing to listen. But she also believed that sometimes you had to strip away the past to reveal the bones of the structure underneath. She believed in cleaning out old spaces, in erasing decades of accumulated grime and damage, in creating something new and fresh from something old and broken. When she bought the colonial-era house on Linden Street in New Jersey, she was thrilled. The house was built around 1760, with original timber framing and a spectacular brick fireplace. The structure was sound, which was rare for a house of its age. The lot was large, with mature trees and a sweeping front porch. It had good bones, as people in the business like to say. With some work, it could be stunning. Lisa got the keys on a Friday and spent the weekend walking through the house, making notes about what needed to be done. The walls needed new drywall. The flooring needed to be replaced or refinished. The basement needed significant work, but nothing that Lisa hadn't done 100 times before. She hired a crew and scheduled them to start the following Monday. Monday morning. As the crew was beginning to remove old wallpaper in the living room, Lisa heard something odd, a voice faint and distant coming from somewhere inside the walls. She ignored it at first,
thinking it was the radio one of the workers had brought, but the voice persisted. It sounded like someone whispering, but she couldn't make out any words. "Did anyone else hear that?" she asked the crew. The workers looked at each other uncomfortably. One of them, a man named Derek who had worked with Lisa for years, nodded slowly. "Yeah, I heard it," he said. "Sounds like someone talking behind the walls." "Probably just pipes," Lisa said, though she didn't entirely believe it. Old houses make all kinds of noises, but as the day went on, the voices became louder and clearer. They seemed to come from different rooms, different walls, as if there were multiple people whispering throughout the house. Sometimes the voices sounded angry. Sometimes they sounded desperate. Sometimes they sounded sad. And they spoke in what seemed to be different dialects and accents, as if they were from different time periods or different parts of the world. By the end of the day, most of the crew was deeply unsettled. Derek approached Lisa as she was locking up. "I don't think I can come back tomorrow," he said quietly. "My wife called me at lunch. She said something felt wrong. She said I shouldn't be working in this house." "Derek, come on," Lisa said. "It's just old pipes and settling foundations." "I don't think so," Derek said, shaking his head. "I've worked on a lot of old houses with you, Lisa. I've never heard anything like this. The voices, they sounded like real people, like they were trying to tell us something." By Tuesday, only 2 workers showed up. By Wednesday, Lisa was alone. One of the workers, a young man named Marcus, called her that morning. "Ms. Lisa, I'm sorry, but I can't come back," he said. His voice sounded frightened. "Last night I heard those voices in my own apartment. All night. Different voices, one after another. I couldn't sleep. My roommate heard them too. He thinks the house followed me home." Another worker sent a text message. "Not coming back. Too scared." Lisa stood in the empty house, surrounded by the work that needed to be done, and made a decision. She would do the work herself. She didn't need a crew. She was strong and capable. She could handle this. Over the next few weeks, Lisa worked alone in the house. She ripped out old wallpaper by hand. She removed walls with a sledgehammer. She tore up flooring and hauled it away in a truck. And with each change she made to the house, the voices grew louder. They came from everywhere now, overlapping and intertwining. Lisa heard men's voices and women's voices and children's voices. She heard English accents and foreign accents. She heard voices that sounded like they came from centuries past and voices that sounded modern. The voices whispered and called and sometimes seemed to cry out in anguish. "Stop it," Lisa would say to the empty air. "I'm trying to help. I'm trying to fix this house," but the voices didn't stop. They grew more intense, more desperate, as if they were trying to tell her something crucial. One afternoon, while removing old plaster from the basement walls, Lisa discovered something that made her stop and stare. Carved into the stone foundation of the house were names. Hundreds of names. Literally hundreds carved carefully into the stone with what must have been a chisel or sharp implement. Each name had a date beside it: Sarah, 1803, James, 1825, Margaret, 1847, Benjamin, 1856, Eleanor, 81. The names went on, covering almost every inch of the basement's stone walls. They spanned over 200 years. Lisa ran her fingers over the carved names, tracing the words that some unknown person had painstakingly etched into stone, century after century. "Who were you?" she whispered to the empty basement. Who were all these people? That night, Lisa went to the local historical society. She spent hours poring over old records, newspapers, and property deeds. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. The house had once belonged to an undertaker named Samuel Hartwell, who had operated his business out of the basement from 1800 until his death in 1865. For 65 years, Samuel had prepared bodies for burial. He had performed this intimate work with hundreds of bodies, people from the community who had died of age or illness or accident. The names carved in the basement, Lisa realized, were the names of all the people he had laid out and prepared. It was his memorial to them, his way of honoring all the lives that had passed through his careful hands. But there was more. Further research revealed that the house had been a stop on the Underground Railroad. Hidden compartments and secret passages had been discovered in the walls during previous renovations. The house had sheltered enslaved people seeking freedom, providing them with food and shelter and safety as they made their way north. Lisa found records of a Quaker family named Thompson, who had owned the house in the 1840s and 1850s. They had been abolitionists, dedicated to helping people escape slavery, and there was more still. During the Civil War, the house had been used by draft resistors and conscientious objectors. Young men who refused to fight had hidden in the basement. The community that sheltered them had been sympathetic to their cause, believing that the war was morally wrong. In the 1920s, during Prohibition, the house's basement had been used to store and distribute bootleg alcohol. Lisa found evidence of a sophisticated operation, with hidden compartments designed to conceal bottles and barrels. And in 1942, according to a newspaper article Lisa discovered in an archive, a woman had abandoned a newborn baby on the front steps of the house. The baby had been found by the residents and had been placed in an orphanage. The article was brief and didn't name the mother, but it spoke of a woman in desperate circumstances unable to care for her child, making the heartbreaking decision to leave the baby where she hoped it would be found and cared for. The house had witnessed centuries of human experience. It had been a place of death and preparation, a sanctuary for those seeking freedom, a shelter for those resisting violence, a business for those flouting the law, and a place of desperation for a mother in crisis. All of these stories, all of these lives and experiences and emotions, seemed to be trapped in the walls of the house. The voices Lisa was hearing were not malevolent. They were not demons or ghosts trying to frighten her away. They were echoes. They were the imprints of real people who had lived real experiences within these walls. They were a house trying to tell its own story, trying to make sure that the people who had passed through it were remembered. Lisa stopped ripping and tearing. She stopped destroying. Instead, she began to preserve. She carefully restored the basement, making sure the carved names on the stone foundation remained visible and protected. She created a small museum in the basement, with displays and plaques documenting the house's history. She researched the names carved in the stone and created biographical information about the people Samuel Hartwell had prepared for burial. She included photographs and documents related to the Underground Railroad. She created a section dedicated to the Civil War draft resistors. She included information about Prohibition and the social movements of that era. For the mother who had abandoned the baby, Lisa researched what she could find. She discovered that the baby had grown up to become a teacher and a community leader. She included that story, creating a narrative of hope from a moment of desperation. And as Lisa worked on this project, something remarkable happened. The voices changed. They became quieter, less desperate. The anger faded from them. Instead, Lisa began to sense something different: gratitude. The house seemed to relax, as if decades or centuries of tension were being released. As if the house itself was taking a deep breath and exhaling for the first time in a very long time. The voices didn't disappear completely, but they changed in character. They became almost peaceful, like whispers of acknowledgement. Like the house was finally being understood. Lisa spent nearly a year working on the project. She didn't flip the house. She didn't gut it and rebuild it and sell it for profit. Instead, she reached out to local historical preservation organizations and eventually connected with the New Jersey Historical Society. They became partners in the project. When the restoration was complete, The house was transferred to the Historical Society. It was open to the public as a museum dedicated to the forgotten people and the forgotten stories that the house had witnessed. The carved names in the basement were behind protective glass, visible to anyone who wanted to see them. Plaques and displays told the stories of Samuel Hartwell and his work. The Underground Railroad section attracted school groups and history enthusiasts. The Civil War section provided a perspective rarely taught in textbooks, and the story of the mother and the abandoned baby, while tragic, became a testament to the complexity of human experience and the interconnection of our lives. Lisa never heard the voices again after the house was officially opened as a museum. But she had done something that she came to understand was far more important than any profit she could have made. She had validated the stories that the house held. She had said to all those people, all those echoes trapped in the walls, you mattered. Your experiences mattered. Your stories will be remembered. Years later, Lisa would sometimes walk past the house when she was in the neighborhood. It stood on Linden Street, brick and beautiful, with a small sign identifying it as a historical museum. People would walk in and out, learning about the past, understanding the complexity of American history in a way that textbooks couldn't convey. And Lisa would stand on the sidewalk and close her eyes. She could still feel them. All those people whose lives the house had touched, Samuel Hartwell and his respectful preparation of the dead, the enslaved people seeking freedom, the young men resisting war, the bootleggers flouting the law, the desperate mother making an impossible choice. They were still there, not as voices or ghosts or frightening presences, but as stories, as memories, as part of the fabric of human experience that the house held in its walls and its stones and its timber. The house had wanted to be remembered. It had tried to tell its story the only way it knew how, through whispers and voices and desperate energy. And when someone finally listened, when someone finally decided to honor the past instead of erasing it, the house had found peace. Lisa learned that sometimes the most important work a person can do is not to build something new, but to honor and preserve what was old, to listen to the stories that buildings and objects have to tell, to make sure that the people who have been forgotten are remembered again. The house on Linden Street still stands today, filled with visitors and school groups and history enthusiasts. And if you listen carefully in the basement, surrounded by the names carved in stone over 200 years, you might just feel the presence of all those people, finally at rest, finally acknowledged, finally remembered.